Hello, and welcome to our valued Morton Arboretum supporters. First of all, we'd like to thank you for your continued support of the Morton Arboretum. Your membership helps us deliver our mission for a greener, healthier, and more beautiful world. We're very excited that you've been able to take a few minutes out of your day to join us for this program on vertical gardening presented by the Plant Clinic, which is generously sponsored by Bartlett Tree Experts. I'm Julie Janoski, manager of the Plant Clinic at the Morton Arboretum. For those of you who may not know, the Plant Clinic is a free service that has trained staff and volunteers who provide homeowners and green professionals with science-based answers to questions about identifying trees and plants, pests and diseases, and best practices plant care. So today I want to talk about gardening up, or vertical gardening. And the first thing I think we need to do is discuss what really is vertical gardening. According to Derek Fell, a veteran gardener and garden writer, vertical gardening is an innovative, effortless, and highly productive growing system that uses bottom-up and top-down supports for a wide variation of plants in small and large spaces. I beg to differ with Mr. Fell on the fact that gardening is never effortless, of course, but gardening up doesn't take any more effort than gardening on the ground does. Why on earth would we want to garden vertically? There's a large number of benefits to gardening vertically, but the key benefits are maximizing limited space by being able to grow more and healthier plants in the same amount of space. Plus, gardening vertically can be very beautiful as well. There are three main types of vertical gardening we're going to talk about today. I'd like you to see how this type of gardening is being used in industrial or commercial installations and food production, but we're going to spend most of our time on home ornamental gardening. Let's start with some examples of the commercial applications that are out there. Patrick Blanc is a premier designer of vertical gardening who has written several books on the topic. This is one of his installations on the side of a European metro station. It was designed as art, but also to camouflage an otherwise unattractive but necessary building in a neighborhood. Other designers are following suit, trying to add the advantages of green space in areas where we typically don't expect to see living plants. This is a mall in the Middle East. Installations like this beautify, but they also help keep the air cooler and cleaner by allowing many times the number of plants in a space than it would otherwise accommodate. This is a Samayamo Library in suburban Vancouver, British Columbia. Enlarging the library took up all of the area allocated for green space on the lot that they had, so they decided to literally garden the walls along the street. So that gives you an idea of some of the commercial applications. There are many, many more. Food production is another common use for vertical gardening. There are lots of commercially made products on the market right now for vertical food production. This picture shows aeroponic gardening, where the plants are grown in vertical columns without soil and are fed liquid nutrients. With the farm-to-table movement taking hold, these rooftop gardens allow city restaurants access to the freshest produce. They can also be set up on the roofs of apartment buildings for residents who might not have access to fresh vegetables. The largest aeroponic farm in the world just opened on July 1st, 2020, on top of a Paris exhibition center. It's several acres large. So this type of food production is probably more our style here in the Midwest. You can use just about anything to garden up. Although you can purchase plant cages and trellises, homemade trellises with things like soccer netting and fish line work just as well. Even tiny installations can produce a lot. Herbs are particularly easy to grow this way. This is one of the larger herb installations that I've seen. This is an example of an installation. These are felt wall pockets, which can be found on the internet and are a great way to get started. These are strawberry plants in the pockets. Again, the materials don't have to be fancy pricey or artistic when it comes to vertical food production. You can use whatever you have on hand. Both of these are also homemade systems. One uses an old pallet, and the second uses plumber pipe. Vertical food gardening doesn't have to take place outdoors only. If you have enough sun or some place for a grow light, you can grow a wall of herbs or even vegetables indoors. You want to make sure that you have an effective method of watering and catching any draining water, however, so that you don't damage anything in the house. This is a short list of edible plants you can grow vertically. In general, all of these plants will be healthier and produce more if vertically staked somehow. Espaliered apple and pear trees, as well as grapes, blackberries, and raspberries, can also be grown on vertical surfaces. All right, so we've talked briefly about commercial applications and about food production. But once we get to ornamental gardens, the options for growing plants vertically are endless. Verticality is important even in the largest gardens to add design elements. Let's take a few minutes and look at some ways people have grown ornamental plants vertically in the home garden. One of the first things you can do with vertical growth is define a space. Creating garden rooms is a key design concept for residential gardeners. What do you need to create in a room? Just like in your house, walls, a ceiling, a floor, and entryways. In this situation, vines on the fence provide green space on a giant billboard of a wall, and they soften that and allow you to grow some plants there. An arched trellis with vines can create an entry point to a garden room. Or you can use multiples to create passageways. What materials and plants you use can show very different styles. Here we see the left-hand gardener taking a very traditional approach, while on the right, we have a much more modern look. Structures with plants growing up them can also help create the overhead plane as well. Verticality can be used to create usable space. In this case, the shrubs and small trees were used to make a side yard along a road, private space rather than public space. Now the family can use this space rather than feeling that it's open to the street. Slopes are considered vertical gardens as well. Managing a slope and gardening up it can help create usable space close to the house. This is a good example of using vertical gardening in several ways to provide an overflow entertaining area and a secondary seating space. Another reason to use verticality in a garden is that it can create some privacy for you. There is a house 5 feet on the other side of this fence. Gardening up the fence gives the homeowner privacy and a much better view than looking directly into their neighbor's kitchen window. This trellis with climbing hydrangea on it makes the homeowners feel separate from the yard behind, even though they are right up against the property line. And this combination of fence and trees protects the house from the alley and less desirable views. In this case, the city would only allow a 6-foot fence, but by adding the arbor and the trees, they were able to hide the commercial building across the alley. Another reason to garden vertically, of course, is anytime a plant is higher than it could be, it gives you another plane to squeeze additional plants in. Look at all the layers in this very small space. You can also create opportunities to garden up where no beds exist. Here are a couple of other examples of homeowners that have taken that idea to stuffing more plants into their yard to the extreme. The one on the left certainly has no lawn whatsoever, and they have lots and lots of plants on a very small lot. And of course, vertical gardening can add beauty where a building or an area might need some, like this rather plain back entryway. When thinking about where to garden vertically in your yard, consider the sides of garages or unattractive fences you might have, plus other maybe not so pretty areas around electric meters or other home mechanicals. You can certainly add beauty to the walls of your home with gardens hung on the vertical plane. Here are a few more examples of that. Imagine these spaces without the gardens hanging on the walls, without the window boxes. They would be very plain indeed. And of course, you can be as elaborate or as simple as you would like. Managing hills doesn't tend to be a huge problem here in suburban Chicago, but where it is an issue, planting things that weep over walls or hold the hills can make these areas more manageable and make it so that you don't have to try and run a lawnmower over them. These happen to be two examples from public spaces, but I think that they also give you an idea of how you can use plants to manage a hill. Personal style, of course, is just as important in vertical gardening as it is in regular gardening. So, are you a little bit country or perhaps a little more elegant? What is your style and how can you express that using your vertical garden? Are you more practical or whimsical? No matter what your style, gardening vertically will always accommodate it. Okay, we've spent quite a bit of our time talking about why you would bother to garden vertically and how people are gardening vertically. So let's spend some time on how to garden vertically. These are all important issues when gardening up, which may be different than if you were gardening just on the ground plane. First of all, you need to have an adequate structure to hold up the weight of both the planting medium, the plants themselves, and the water it will require to keep them alive. Often these structures will require sturdy attachments or even supplemental building support if you are doing something like a roof garden. Some plants are just really heavy and will take a trellis or any other structure down, like your gutters, as they mature. Climbing hydrangea and wisteria are good examples of plants that need heavy-duty support in order not to damage the surrounding structures. Irrigation and drainage is also a little bit more complicated than if you were gardening on the ground plane. You need to be able to water the plants, first of all, and often natural rainfall is not adequate because rain, of course, also falls vertically rather than horizontally and won't necessarily reach all of the plants. Consider soaker hoses or drip irrigation for your vertical gardens, especially if access is a problem. This young gardener is helping out by watering the lower portions of this garden, but he'll be unable to reach the top sections even with the help of his watering can. You also need access to care for and, if necessary, replace plants. That library in Vancouver I showed you the picture of found that they had not provided any access to prune or care for the plants without damaging them. Layers of plants that you often find in a vertical garden will need additional ventilation to prevent disease. Hanging these wall pockets on a fence is an ideal situation because you can get the wind blowing through the felt. You will also need supplemental light in some cases. The bottoms of these gardens get less light than the top. So if you plant larger plants or plants that require less light at the bottom, that will help the entire planting get what it needs. Plants to try for climbing are climbing roses, clematis, hops, ivies, climbing honeysuckle, if you're looking for vining plants. But with wall systems, like I showed you, you can plant nearly anything you would plant on the ground. That library in Vancouver actually has limelight hydrangeas, which get 8 feet tall, planted on the side of their building. Be careful to understand, though, how the plant attaches to the trellis if it's vining, so you know how to provide support. It could be twining, which climbs by twining the stems around the supports, clinging by attaching themselves directly to the surface of the support, grabbing at the supports by using specific plant parts like tendrils or leaf stems, or sprawling. These send up tall shoots that arch over the old branches. Most climbing roses, for instance, fall in this category, and these plants will need to be tied to their supports. There are an amazing number of structural options for creating vertical gardens. Anything from trellises, the wall itself, wall boxes and pockets, hanging pots, window boxes, ground level pots and boxes, and then also think about using just upright, very narrow plants in some of these situations. Here are a few things to consider as you're selecting plants and structures for your vertical garden. First of all, the permanency of the structure, the shade tolerance of the plants. You want to select plants that will actually accommodate colder zones because the root systems are going to freeze harder and faster if they're in the air than they would in the ground. Of course, you want to choose plants wisely for their mature size. Not all of us can support an 8 by 8 foot bush on a trellis or on the side of our house. And you want to size the structure with regard to maintenance. Can you reach it? Will you need to prune this plant? Do you need to water the top pockets and you don't have access to them? And then again, please don't forget how heavy all of that is. A lot of times, especially with the wall pockets, you will need to provide additional support for those in order to make sure that it doesn't pull down whatever it's attached to. All right, before we end, I'd like to show you some additional examples of vertical gardening in the ornamental home landscape. Again, it could be as simple as a wooden trellis with a vine growing up it to decorate a blank wall, or as elaborate as a series of trellises that fill the whole front yard that you then grow plants on. Here you see walls and fences being used for vertical gardening. And this is more window boxes and pots that are hung on walls. When I was on a plant tour, a garden tour, I saw this beautiful little garden on the second story with these windows up there. And I actually stopped the homeowner and I said, how do you keep your plants in your window boxes looking so good? Turns out they're silk. So not that I'm advocating that, but you know, if that's what it takes to have a great looking garden, go for it. Here's that idea of taller vertical plants. Even though there's a trellis behind there and a small vine, it's the vertical plants in this situation, in pots on the ground, that's creating that vertical gardening space. And here's a way to create some privacy behind a bench with a trellis that has vines growing over it. And the pots also stand up off the ground, so they are more vertical than what's planted in the ground. Here's a very informal trellis made out of wattling, which is limber branches that are woven together to create a trellis or a fence. And that is a honeysuckle vine that is growing up it. You can see how well it creates some privacy. And of course, even the Morton Arboretum has its own examples of growing vertically. This is in the May T. Watts garden, which is off of our library, and I encourage you to go visit this beautiful little space when you go over to the administration building. So that's all the information I have today on planting a vertical garden. Feel free to contact the plant clinic at the Morton Arboretum by phone or email. That's our phone number. That's our email address. And if you enjoyed this presentation, would like to know more, see our online learning opportunities at www.mortonarb.org/learningplace. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for supporting the Morton Arboretum.